Bonjour tout le monde. Nom moi c'est Nnamdi Hodge. Moi sorti Trinidad. For the last 20 years, I have been documenting, researching, and teaching French Creole from Trinidad, Grenada, and Venezuela. Today I'm going to speak to you a bit about Trinidad French Creole and touch a bit on Venezuelan French Creole. I hope you enjoy my presentation. I always start every session I do with a proverb. So this Trinidad French Creole proverb says, Benye ishmoun, me pa lave, deye zowey yo. Benye ishmoun, me pa lave, deye zowey yo. Which means, you can bathe people's children, but don't wash behind their ears. It's about respecting boundaries and limits. So we're going to start by looking at the history of French Creole in Trinidad. Most folks are surprised to find out that French Creole is and was spoken in Trinidad because we were never an official French colony. We were never under French political rule. Yet, most of the 19th century, French and French Creole culture were dominant. Our French Creole was imported. It came to Trinidad through immigration, namely from the neighboring French Creole islands. Trinidad started off as a Spanish colony. We were claimed for the King of Spain by Columbus in 1498. The actual name Trinidad was given because Columbus saw we have three hills to the south of Trinidad that are referred to as the Trinity Hills, and he named them after the Holy Trinity, so La Trinidad. But under Spanish rule, we were very underpopulated, and there was not enough people in the country to actually have a sufficient labor force and develop the vast amounts of fertile land. As a result, the King of Spain issued a cedula in 1783, the second, which invited people to come and settle in Trinidad in exchange for a lot of good incentives. For example, you would get a certain amount of land and a certain amount of tax exemptions based on the amount of slaves, the number of slaves you were accompanied by. Many planters in the neighboring French colonies took up the offer and came to Trinidad in great numbers with their French Creole speaking slaves. So from as close as Grenada, which was at the time a French colony, to as far as Haiti, Saint-Domingue. People came from all these French territories with their French Creole speaking slaves and populated Trinidad. So eventually this French and French Creole speaking population became the dominant group in Trinidad. They outnumbered the English speakers and the Spanish speakers. So as I mentioned, for most of the 19th century, French and French Creole language and culture were dominant in Trinidad. All of the music we had that was performed in the 19th century in Trinidad was done in French Creole. Our calypso, our Bele, our stick fighting music was all performed in French Creole. We actually had education being conducted for most of the 19th century in French, and the vernacular of Trinidad was French Creole. So we're looking next at the decline of French Creole. So today, French Creole is an endangered language where the speakers are between 60 and 80 years old, and we have about roughly 3,000 or so fluent speakers of the language. Coming from a time when it was our most widely used language, now it's on the decline, and we look at what started its decline. So the English government, faced with this big wall of speakers of French, Creole, and French, embarked upon a policy to impose English language and culture, which was referred to as the Anglicization policy. And this policy is what started the decline of French Creole, the policy by the government to impose and enforce English language and culture. For most of the first half of the 19th century, education was conducted in French. So the English government in about 1850 set up a series of ward schools. At the time we were divided into wards and made English the only possible language of instruction. So as a result, English became important to improve your socio-economic situation and get a better life. So parents now saw a link between their children acquiring English and improving their life. So when English came on the scene, French Creole was seen as being a language of the old world, of the plantation, of poverty. And parents began to discourage their children from speaking French Creole because they thought that it would affect their acquisition of English. And they retained French Creole as a code language among adults when they wanted to speak what they referred to as bagay gomoun, right? So adults topics. They would have used French Creole and spoke to their children in English in an attempt to stamp out French Creole or the use of it among their children. So by the turn of the 20th century, there was a decline in monolingual French Creole speakers. As education reached the far corners of Trinidad, English and English Creole quickly replaced French Creole as the most widely spoken languages, and the number of monolingual French Creole speakers began to decline. By the 1940s, French Creole became an endangered language in Trinidad because most of the speakers were elderly speakers, and it was kept among them as a code language to exclude children from adults' conversation. So it said anybody who was born after the 1940s in Trinidad most likely cannot speak French Creole fluently. Most of the speakers of French Creole in Trinidad are now between the ages of 60 and 80. So within the next 30 years, when most of them are dead, the language will most likely be dead as well. Despite the decline of French Creole, there are still areas in Trinidad where it's still spoken, and these areas are sort of remote rural areas. Some of them are Paramin, Blanchisses, Moruga, Kumaka, Cameron, San Rafael, Tabaquite, Arima, Pinal, Maraval, and Rancho Quemado. These areas are agricultural areas and fairly rural, so education didn't really make an impact in these areas until quite recently. So with all of this change in attitudes towards French Creole, the French Creole speakers began to feel ashamed of using it, and people would laugh at the accent or the use of the language when they came into the urban areas. So in the following video, there are some French Creole speakers discussing people's reactions to the use of French Creole and how it made them feel as French Creole speakers.
L'autre, il dit nous avons français, parti français, avec bagage qui croisé. Mais
langage cochon.
Non, ouais, même.
Langage cochon. Mais en présent, regardez, vous savez quand vous dites pour langage cochon en présent?
Non, mais attends.
Mais pas qu'à prendre l'argent.
Hey! Je vais dire une question à présent. La matière jeune. La matière jeune garçon. Jeune. Personne ne partait ça sans moi. Parler par toi. Pas mettez qu'à
c'est oui. Les gars, c'est oui.
Non, mettez qu'à comment on dit? Non, pas capon.
C'est sauvage.
Non, caché. Comment on dit? Shame. Parce qu'on peut parler partout, personne ne peut parler. Tout le monde peut parler anglais. Anglais plus belle passer ça passe. Ou sortir à country, vous connaissez.
Depuis vous commencez à parler par toi.
Oui. Vous country bouki.
Oui, vous sortez à boire.
Oui, vous sortez à boire.
Vous sortez au macaron comme ça.
Country.
Mais à présent.
À présent. Ça pile monde
ça c'est la vérité. Léo dit où sortir à boire, ou pas de cette opère?
Non, c'est
vrai. À boire, ou sortir
oui, mais il y a qui ont contribué.
Mais
c'est ça, ou
quand on fait,
mais c'est pas quand on fait, ou quand on honte.
Honte, oui. Oui, ça, mais Léo dit où c'est contribué.
Mais c'est ça qui a fait honte. Oui. Ou pas parler aucun patois. Et puis attends ça, ou pas parler plus à pile qu'on ou pas oui pour rester. Comment? Oui.
Il y a moun qui te dit. Depuis moi temps nous ka parler, moi connaître c'est bois ou sortir à monde. Tan ou sorti par amen.
Oui. Ou pas moi te ka honte pour 10 moun, moi ka rester par amen. Parce que même bagarre yo ka contribuer qui
Nnamdi
mais attends ça à pile de femmes à pile de filles ou pas de personne qui contribuer qui
Okay, as I mentioned before, a lot of our music that was created in the 19th century was performed in French Creole. So we have Bele music as is found in the French Caribbean, as well as Bele dances. So in the next slide we will listen and learn the words to a very popular Trinidad French Creole Bele song. So this song is called Vini danse Bele, which means in English, come dance the Bele, written by Carlton Papa George Matthew. So on the left we have the French Creole and your English on the right. Let's take a listen to it.
Vini danse Bele, Vini danse Bele. Ay nene no, Vini danse Bele. Vini danse Bele, Vini danse Bele. Ay nene no, Vini danse Bele. Vini danse Bele. Ay nene no, Vini danse Bele. Ay nene no, Vini danse Bele. Ay nene no, ay nene no, Vini danse Bele. Vini danse Bele, Vini danse Bele. Ay nene no, Vini danse Bele. Vini danse Bele, Vini danse Bele. Ay nene no, Vini danse Bele. Mama mwen pe danse. Oui nene no. Papa mwen pe danse. Oui nene no. Sese mwen pe danse. Oui nene no. Ay nene no, Vini danse Bele. Vini danse Bele, Vini danse Bele. Ay nene no, Vini danse Bele. Vini danse Bele, Vini danse Bele. Ay nene no, Vini danse Bele. Mwen pe danse ici. Oui nene no. Mwen pe danse pa la. Oui nene no. Mwen pe danse a ho. Oui nene no. Ay nene no, Vini danse Bele. Vini danse Bele, Vini danse Bele. Ay nene no, Vini danse Bele.
Trinidad and Venezuela at the closest point are just 7 miles apart. So it's no surprise to find out that there has been much migration between the countries. So many Venezuelan Spanish speakers came and settled in Trinidad, and many Trinidad French Creole speakers went and settled in Venezuela. The eastern coast of Venezuela, as well as such areas as El Callao, have had a very strong French Creole presence. At one time in areas like Guerrero, French Creole was more widely used than Spanish, since there was more interaction with Trinidad than other parts of Venezuela. For example, Guerrero is closer to Trinidad than other parts of Venezuela. So there was a lot of commerce and exchanges done with Trinidad up to the 1960s. French Creole was carried to Venezuela by immigrants from the French islands as well as, and I would say mainly, by French Creole speaking Trinidadians and Grenadians. So as a result, their French Creole is very similar to Trinidadian and Grenadian French Creole. There are very few French Creole speakers left in Venezuela, and at one time the Chavez government had been making great efforts to preserve and promote it. They had several conferences on French Creole in Venezuela, starting in 2005 and as recently as 2011, where they were trying to have it preserved, even have it being taught in schools. In the following slide, we'll see a video of a Patois speaker, a French Creole speaker from Venezuela, speaking about her experience as a child speaker in French Creole in Guerrero, at a time when there were very few children speaking it.
Moi, à l'école, ils n'ont pas de place.
Ok. Et à l'école là, vous avez parlé espagnol?
À l'école là, quand moi, je n'ai pas de monde qui parle pas toi.
Pièce monde?
Non.
C'est Annie là que vous avez parlé?
Oui. Moi, je ne parle pas toi et puis comme ma maman.
Ok.
À l'autre place, quand moi, je n'ai pas de parler pas. Le matin, ici, tu as oui. Et tu as des gens qui ne parlent pas toi, moi, pas de parler. Mais tu as des gens qui ne parlent pas toi. Et puis moi, c'est un petit maman. Et puis moi, je n'ai moi pour moi parler pas toi.
Ok.
Oui. Parce que je ne connais pas petit maman qui parle pas toi. Et les gens qui ne parlent pas toi à la rue, là, je te connais pas moi pour moi parler pas toi. Pas de petit maman qui parle pas toi.
Et à présent, vous connaissez le monde qui parle pas toi ici en ville?
Oui, mais pas en pile, non. Mais longtemps, il y a un pile, mais pas à présent. C'était vieux monde, déjà, c'est mon chambre.
So next I'll speak a bit about my preservation efforts at saving our dying Trinidad French Creole language. I wrote a songbook and published it in 2009 entitled Vini Chanté en Patois, which has about 30 or so Trinidad French Creole songs, a mixture of genres from Bele music to folk songs to game songs to stick fighting songs. I've also audiovisually documented French Creole speakers from Trinidad, Grenada, and Venezuela, starting in 2001 or so. I have two YouTube channels where I have some of these videos posted. One, Cat Vixen Chick and Nnamdi Hodge are my two YouTube channels. You will see some of my videos of Venezuelan, Grenadian, and Trinidad Patois speakers posted with subtitles. Some of them are subtitled. I also have a Facebook page called Trinidad Patois Speakers. Now we use the word Patois because in Trinidad, French Creole refers to an ethnic group. So we use the word Patois to avoid being too ambiguous to Trinidadians. So we use the word Patois to the layman, but we use the word French Creole in more academic settings and circles. I also have been giving classes since 1999 with emphasis on the Trinidad variety of French Creole. And now my classes are being, well, thanks to the coronavirus and the restrictions, I have started to offer French Creole classes online, starting in about March or so. I've had 2 levels being offered online. If you're interested, you could contact me afterwards to be part of a Trinidad French Creole class. Okay, so merci en pile et puis ayo tout le monde. Thank you very much and goodbye everybody.